Okay, continuing on with Lecture 3.2, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. We're on our last part, Part 3, which is the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. So again, our objective is still to explain the causes and consequences of the English Civil War, but now we're really focusing on the consequences of the Civil War and what happens in England throughout the rest of the 17th century and kind of even looking around the corner into the 18th century. Our key concepts are going to be 2.1.2. Challenges to absolutism resulted in alternative political systems. And key concept 2.1.2.a, the outcome of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution protected the rights of gentry and aristocracy from absolutism through assertions of the rights of Parliament. So the major themes are still going to be political states and other institutions of power, and also national and European identity. So the period from 1660 to 1688 is really known as the Restoration, and that refers to the restoration of the English monarchy after the interregnum. So again, Cromwell had died in 1658. He had been succeeded by his son Richard, who was ineffective, and also by this point, the people of England were tired of puritanical absolutism. So a Cavalier Parliament, and by Cavalier we refer to sort of supporters of the monarchy, more traditional nobility, decided to restore Charles II to the throne in 1660. So Charles II was one of two sons of Charles I. Now, while in exile in France, because the French monarchy were his cousins basically, Charles had agreed to abide by Parliament's decisions in the post-war settlement. This meant that Parliament was stronger in relation to the king than ever before in England. So one of the caveats of the Restoration is that the king had to give up some of his political power. Also, Charles agreed to a significant degree of religious toleration, and he in particular favored Catholics. Now, this wasn't a demand from Parliament that he favored Catholics. The demand was that he have religious toleration, but Charles II was very favorable towards Catholics, and that's likely due to the influence of his French family and the French monarchy that he had spent time with during the interregnum. But you have to also remember that England still has a really extreme anti-Catholic culture in a lot of ways. Like going back all the way to the days of Mary I and Elizabeth, there had been this like anti-Catholic culture in England, this paranoia, if you will, this idea that there's this secret papal plot to take back England. Like this is a real present and well-known sort of suspicion and paranoia among the English people, especially, the upper levels of society. So keep that in the back of your mind throughout all of this, that there's this, this suspicion of a secret papal conspiracy. And that's not new. That has been around this whole century. Now, generally, the Restoration is seen as a positive period in European history, although there will continue to be religious divisions. But that's largely due to the personality of Charles II. So Charles II had a really affable, friendly, easygoing personality. So sometimes he's known as the Merry Monarch, or as I like to call him, the king who brought back partying. He liked to just have big fancy parties and have a good time. He had lots of mistresses who were also very famous in their own way. But this was a breath of fresh air after the stark days of the puritanical absolutism. So they're bringing back dancing and music and drinking and laughter and theater and sports and fancy clothing and Christmas and all those things they had not been allowed to have before. Also, Charles II, you might notice with these extreme Whigs, he is the namesake of the King Charles Spaniel, which I just wanted to throw in there. King Charles Spaniels are adorable little fluffy dogs like you see, but I'm sure you can also notice the resemblance here between Charles II on the right and a King Charles Spaniel on the left. Okay. Now, during the Restoration, we're also going to see the development of Britain's first political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. This is going to continue to be really influential in British politics all throughout the 18th and into the 19th century. So we will be talking about the Whigs and the Tories again later when we come back to British politics in another unit. So the Whigs initially were anti-Catholic, and they would be opposed to James II, the next king, who actually is a Catholic. More on that in a moment. They were opposed to him inheriting the throne. That's more short-term, though. In the long term, the Whigs were made up of the wealthy middle class and also some Puritans who favored parliamentary sovereignty and religious toleration. So in general, we can think of the Whigs as being more liberal, whereas the Tories initially supported James II, a Catholic monarch, but in the long run, they are more made up of the nobles, the gentry, the Anglicans. They tend to support the power of the monarchy over Parliament, so they are essentially conservative. So again, the Whigs are liberal, the Tories are conservative. The way I often remember this is I think of the Tories as conservatory. Kind of sounds like conservative. Anyways, that's just a little trick that I use. They're conservatory. All right, moving on. Okay, what's the drama that happens in the Restoration? First, we have the Clarendon Code. So the Clarendon Code was instituted in 1661 by monarchists and Anglicans who sought to drive all Puritans out of political and religious life. So as you can see, this is really a backlash against the Puritans and their dictatorship and their extremism in a lot of ways. So this is an example of how there continues to be these religious divisions in England. Part of the Clarendon Code was also something called the Test Act of 1673. The Test Act technically excluded those unwilling to receive the sacrament of the Church of England from voting, from holding office, from preaching, teaching, from attending universities, or from assembling for meetings. That's pretty extreme. But what's this show? This shows us that this is not only anti-Puritan, it's also anti-Catholic. So the Anglicans are really, not only lashing out at the Puritans, but there's also that anti-Catholic paranoia and hysteria and suspicion in England, especially among the Parliament still. This isn't helped by the fact that Charles seems to support Catholicism in a lot of ways, and this, in essence, drew a lot of criticism from the Whigs in Parliament. Charles II granted freedom of worship to Catholics in England, which many people were opposed to. Also, this isn't known at the time, but we know now in hindsight that Charles had made a secret deal with Louis XIV, his cousin, in 1670, where France would give England money every year in exchange for Charles relaxing restrictions on the Catholics, and England would support the French in their fight against the Dutch. So this is really dicey. This is actually like legitimate evidence of potential Catholic conspiracy in England, right? Because here's Charles making a secret deal with the French Catholic king. At one point, Charles even dissolved Parliament when it passed a law denying royal succession to Catholic, and this was an issue because Charles's younger brother James was a Catholic, and it turns out that James will need to inherit because Charles won't have any surviving heirs other than his brother. And I think the biggest shocker of all, and this confirmed, of course, a lot of the fears and suspicions of the Parliament and the sort of anti-Catholic contingency, is that on his deathbed, Charles II declared himself as a Catholic. He actually came out and admitted to being a Catholic and received the last rites just before he died. This definitely was very, very, very dramatic. Okay, but before we move on to James II, there's a few other topics that we need to consider here in the Restoration that are important for the sort of the political foundation of the Glorious Revolution. So first of all, Parliament passed something called the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679. And this was another attempt by Parliament to limit Charles's power. So Parliament at this point was dominated by the Whigs. Remember, they are the more liberal party that tends to favor parliamentary sovereignty over the monarch. So in the Habeas Corpus Act, the provisions asked that judges were enabled to demand that prisoners be in court during their trial. So prisoners had to be present for their trial. It also required just cause for continued imprisonment. It provided for speedy trials, and it forbid double jeopardy. So this is establishing a tradition of sort of natural rights and individual rights, especially legal rights, for the people of England. And we will see that's a big deal in the Glorious Revolution. Also, Charles II continued to have issues with Scotland. Like I said, this is pretty much a constant throughout the 17th century. Now, Scotland had again gained its independence when Charles II assumed the throne of England in 1660. But Charles reneged on the 1651 pledge that had acknowledged Presbyterianism in Scotland. And in 1661, he actually declared himself the head of the Church of Scotland. And in doing so, he wanted to impose the Episcopal form of church hierarchy in Scotland, similar to the Anglican Church. This was seen by the Scots as a huge violation, essentially as the England creating a dictatorship, this religious and political dictatorship. And so, not surprisingly, there's resistance to it. But Charles was brutal in how he treated that resistance. Thousands of Scottish were killed for resisting what they perceived to be this dictatorship. So much so that the last few years of Charles's reign in Scotland are known as the killing time. And there's also all these horrific stories about religious conflict and martyrdom and just brutality in Scotland during this time. Again, England and Scotland's conflict is almost constant throughout this period. Okay, but honestly, that was not a major topic. What we really want to focus on with the Restoration are the actions of the monarchs and how this is leading to the Glorious Revolution. Scotland doesn't really contribute to the Glorious Revolution at all. So after Charles II died, without any heirs of his own, the throne passes to his Catholic brother, James II. Now, James II was 55 years old when he became king, and as a Catholic, he wanted to return England to Catholicism, which is a really, really terrifying concept for Parliament and for many people in England, especially after all of the conflict that had just taken place. And you might remember that the last time someone tried to return England to Catholicism, that was Mary I, that also had not gone well and was a really unpopular move. So this is, as you can imagine, it's not going to last a very long time. But still, in the 3 years that James was king, he appointed many Catholics to high positions in the government, in colleges. He favored Catholics a lot. So ultimately, this is what leads to the Glorious Revolution. So the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was the final act in the struggle for political sovereignty in England. When push came to shove, Parliament was not willing to sacrifice the constitutional gains of the English Civil War, and they were not willing to return to an absolute monarchy in England. So the two issues that really drove Parliament to action to pursue this glorious revolution. The first was James's reissue of the Declaration of Indulgence, which granted freedom of worship to Catholics. And not just that, but that he also demanded that this declaration be read in the Anglican Church on 2 successive Sundays. But I think the really scary option here is that James had a son in 1688 that was baptized Catholic. And now the English people are looking at the restoration of a Catholic dynasty in England. And that was too much for them to bear. So ultimately, a group of the most prominent nobles and members of Parliament are going to take matters into their own hands and try to find a way to replace James. So that's what the Glorious Revolution is all about. Basically, Parliament replaces the monarch of their own accord. So James II is going to be forced to abdicate his throne. It turns out that he had 2 adult daughters from his previous marriage. Those daughters were Mary and Anne, and they were Protestants. And Mary, the older of the 2 daughters, had married the Dutch stadtholder William of Orange, who was more or less the political leader of the Netherlands. This is a different William of Orange than you may have read about in Unit 2 with the revolt of the Netherlands against Philip II. Same family, the House of Orange. Yes, his name is William, but it's a different person because that other one lived 100 years prior. So anyways, there's a lot of William of Oranges, just deal with it. Kind of like there's a lot of Henrys, there's a lot of Louis, we can't get around it. But this one's married to Mary. That's how we can think of it, as William and Mary. So these nobles go over to William and Mary and literally ask them to invade England and overthrow James II. And now William of Orange would agree to this because this would be a really good move for him and a really good move for the Netherlands, which are being besieged by France and Louis XIV. But William would only do it if he knew he had the popular support of England, and also his Dutch troops could accompany him. Like, he really didn't want to have to fight a war if he could avoid it. But the people of England actually did want this to happen. The nobility, the parliament, and much of the popular support of England did not want the Catholic dynasty that was offered to them by James II. They wanted peace and stability. They wanted moderation in politics, moderation in religion, and William and Mary could offer that. So they have this relatively bloodless invasion of England in 1688. This is why this is called the Glorious Revolution, because it is essentially a peaceful and bloodless revolution. Because later that year, in 1688, James will flee to France and abdicate the throne. And you may ask, like, well, why did he do that? Why did he give up so easily? Remember, just a few decades earlier, England had easily executed its own king. And seeing as how he probably wanted to keep his head attached to the rest of his body, James recognized it was in his best interest to flee the country as quickly as possible. So by abdicating the throne, William III and Mary II are now declared joint monarchs by Parliament. But they were required to accept the Bill of Rights before they could become the monarchs. All right, so the Bill of Rights is a really, really important document in English history. It is essentially the English Constitution. It's as sacred and foundational to modern English government as our own constitution is to our government. All right. So the Bill of Rights is essentially what confirms England as a constitutional monarchy. So they're still going to have their monarchy. They still to this day have their monarchy. But the Bill of Rights establishes what is called parliamentary sovereignty, which means that Parliament really has the power now. The kings are never going to be as powerful as they were under the days of the Tudor dynasty with Henry and Elizabeth. Those days are long past. In a constitutional monarchy with parliamentary sovereignty, the parliament is now more powerful than the monarch. And this becomes the hallmark for constitutionalism in Europe. Later, once we get especially into the 19th century and the 20th century, most surviving monarchies will be forced to adopt this type of constitutional model. If there are monarchies in Europe today, like Spain and Sweden and the Netherlands, they are constitutional monarchies. And so, like I said, this is not only a really important foundational document for England and its identity, but it also is really influential for later constitutional monarchies in Europe. So the English Constitution is made up of the Petition of Right, going all the way back to 1628, the Habeas Corpus Act, which deals with the legal rights of the English people, and also the Bill of Rights. And we're going to talk more specifically about the Bill of Rights here. And some of these provisions may seem pretty familiar to you because the American Bill of Rights and the American Constitution was also strongly influenced by the English Bill of Rights. So let's look at some of these provisions, shall we? First of all, the monarch could not be a Roman Catholic, and that has remained true throughout English history. That's still true today. Now, that's not something the U.S. shares, but still, the other ones will seem much similar. Laws could only be made by the consent of Parliament, so the monarch no longer has the ability to make their own laws. Parliament has the right of free speech. A standing army in peacetime was not legal without parliamentary approval. Taxation was illegal without parliamentary approval. Excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishments were prohibited. The right to a trial by jury, due process of law, and reasonable bail were guaranteed. People had the right to bear arms, well, at least Protestants did, but not Catholics. It provided for free elections to Parliament, and it could be dissolved only by its own consent, meaning Parliament could only be dissolved by its own consent. And people also had the right to petition the government, meaning people had the right to complain and criticize the government. That's what that means. But it's also important to note that the Glorious Revolution did not amount to a democratic revolution. This does not mean that England is now a democracy. Political power is going to remain largely in the hands of the nobility and the gentry until at least the mid-19th century. And Parliament is still going to basically represent the upper classes. When we get to the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution and more socioeconomic diversity, then we will start to see a little bit more true political equality in England, but it will be slow to come. Up until then, the majority of the English people did not have a say in political affairs at all. And like I said, it will remain that way until the 19th and even to some extent the 20th century. Still, the most notable defense of the Glorious Revolution came from a political philosopher named John Locke and his work, The Second Treatise of Government. So John Locke is a really, really famous philosopher in European history. This is definitely a name that you want to know and you want to remember. He is going to be very influential to the Enlightenment and many of the philosophers associated with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. We'll talk about that in Unit 4. But also his ideas are very influential, of course, to the American Constitution and American values. For example, in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, John Locke states that people create a government to protect their, quote, natural rights of life, liberty, and property. I'm sure that sounds very similar to an American value that we have in our own Declaration of Independence, except that one is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because America had some issues with slavery at this point too that we won't get into because that's not this class. Okay, a few more important political developments as we sort of wrap up the 17th century here of English history. The first is the Toleration Act of 1689. This helps allow, again, for moderation in religious policy and practice. This granted the right to worship for Protestant nonconformists, that basically means Puritans and Quakers. They were allowed to worship, but they could not hold office. Still, it did not extend religious liberties to Catholics, to Jews, or to Unitarians, which were another radical Protestant minority that we don't have to worry about. Now, the next one is the Act of Settlement in 1701, and it said that if King William or his sister-in-law Anne died without children, the crown would go to the granddaughter of James I, who was this Hanoverian, meaning German, Electress Dowager, and to her heirs. So just a little bit of explanation here on the succession we're going to see at the tail end of the Stuart dynasty. So William and Mary actually did not have any surviving children of their own. They're going to be succeeded by Mary's younger sister, Anne. And if you heard about this movie called The Favorite that came out just last award season last year, that was about Queen Anne. She was the last Stuart monarch, and she is quite the character. And Olivia Colman, who played Queen Anne, got an Oscar for her performance. I loved the movie. It's fascinating, and I highly recommend it if that's something that you're interested in. Anyways, Anne, despite having 17 pregnancies, died without children, and so as the last Stuart monarch, this meant that the English throne passed to this distant cousin in Germany, what we call now the Hanoverian dynasty. Now you may be wondering, like, what's the purpose of this? Why was this necessary? You got to remember that there were still Stuarts from James II. So James II and his sons believed themselves to be the rightful monarchs of England well into the 18th century. And much of the 18th century saw these sort of Stuart wannabe monarchs petitioning countries across Europe for support and trying to, restore themselves to the throne. This is going to cause a lot of drama in Scotland. So also if you've read Outlander or you've heard of that TV show, it's based largely in that context later in the 18th century. But again, the purpose of the Act of Settlement was to deny James II and his sons from inheriting the English throne. So that's why it goes to essentially some distant German cousins. And that begins what is known as the Hanover dynasty, where we get all those Georges, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Now, one other important development, as we're sort of wrapping things up here, is the Act of Union. Now, the Act of Union is what actually unites formally, officially, and permanently England and Scotland into the country known as Great Britain. And on the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you can see the coat of arms created to celebrate the Act of Union, which has the two national animals, the lion to represent England, and yes, that is a unicorn to represent Scotland. In case you didn't know it, the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, which is pretty awesome, if you ask me. Okay, but back to history. I have mentioned throughout this whole lecture that England and Scotland have been fighting off and on all throughout the 17th century. So now, why on earth would Scotland agree to give up its independence? Well, frankly, it all comes down to money. The Scots desperately desired access to England's trade empire and believed that it would continue to fall behind the rest of Europe if it did not enter into a union. So it was all about the money England had this prosperous trade empire, and Scotland wanted in on the action. Also, Scottish Presbyterians, which had had a rough go on it the past 100 years, feared that the Stuarts, who were now staunchly Catholic, might attempt a return to the throne in Scotland, since the throne of Scotland is the original throne of the Stuart dynasty, going all the way back to Mary, Queen of Scots. So they wanted protection from that with England. So within a few decades, Scotland transformed into a modern society with dynamic economic and intellectual growth. Nowadays, Scotland has started to explore independence from Great Britain. You might remember that a couple years ago, the Scottish people actually held an election to see if they should separate from Great Britain. And it was defeated, so they're still part of it. And the issue, once again, was money, because Scotland is currently on the same currency as England, that's the pound. And the real reason why Scotland, that election did not succeed and Scotland did not separate is because they did not want to lose the economic stability that came from being with Britain. So even 400 years later, that's still the unifying factor. Okay, last slide. So this is getting ahead into the 18th century a little bit, but I think this is still really valuable information to help us understand the political structure of the modern English government. I mean, this is ultimately some of the things that we still see in the English government today. So by the time we get to the 18th century, we'll see the emergence of what is called the cabinet system, where there's leading ministers. Remember, ministers, these are like members of parliament. And the ministers tended to lead different departments, like the Department of Defense or the Department of Agriculture, except in Europe, they tend to be called ministries. So the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Magic, things like that. So these leading ministers, who were members of the House of Commons and had the support of the majority of the members, would make common policy and conduct the business of the country. They were basically like an executive committee that ran the country. And the leader was called the prime minister. He or she at this point was a leading member of the majority and was the leader of the government. So today, in British politics, whatever political party has the most seats in Parliament, and there tends to be more of a multi-party system in England, whoever party has the most amount of seats, the leader of that party is seen as the prime minister, and the prime minister is basically the political leader of England. So right now, Boris Johnson is the prime minister of England. That won't probably be the case for much longer, but they are the person who is really in charge, and the monarch, out of formality, they consult with the monarch, but really the monarch has no political power at this point. So the first prime minister is generally seen as this guy, Robert Walpole. They didn't officially have the title of prime minister, but in action and experience and achievements, he's really seen as the first prime minister. And he led the English cabinet, again, that executive committee, in the first almost 2 decades in the first part of the 18th century. And this once again established the precedent that the cabinet was responsible to the House of Commons, but it reinforces that notion of parliamentary sovereignty. So when we sum up everything that has happened in this lecture in 3.2, really what this is about is the transition of political power in England. It began with Stuart monarchs like James I and Charles I trying to push towards absolutism, which was the political trend we see in continental Europe. But this led, of course, to that power struggle with Parliament, and the outcome was parliamentary sovereignty. So England became a constitutional monarchy with parliamentary sovereignty. That means that Parliament is more powerful than the monarch. The monarchy continues to be an important element in English tradition, in English identity. Many English people to this day are very proud of their monarch. It is an important part of English culture, but regardless, England is a very progressive, very constitutional based country in the sense that it is not an absolute monarchy by the end of the 17th century. And we will learn more about other constitutional countries and other absolute monarchies later in this unit. So thank you for your time, and thank you to my cute dog Bowie, who cuddled up next to me throughout this whole lecture. I hope he enjoyed it as much as you guys did. Thanks.